Welcome to part 30 of my game system design series. In this case, I will be drilling down into the DBN set of Napoleonic's rules, specifically version 2.1, which was published in 2008. There were earlier versions of which I do not have a copy, and I'm uncertain if there are any later versions than the one I possess at the present moment. While I ordered what I thought was the rules, instead I received a campaign guide, so the rules I ended up using was a PDF version available on the internet. The objective is to allow potential players to determine if these rules are suitable for them by looking at the basic elements of the rules. The most important aspect of any rules is its scale, as this affects a host of other factors, such as what type of game you would expect, what amount of movement, and to a lesser extent, the force mixes you require. Next most important factor is the game system itself, such as sequence of play, visibility, movement, and fire combat systems. This will tell you how historically accurate, or otherwise, a set of rules is, as well as how playable they are. The gameplay tells us how easy or difficult playing a game is. This requires play testing, as it cannot be derived from reading the rules. This tells you how playable the rules are. Learning the rules is a combination of complexity, rules presentation, and examples. Simple game systems can be difficult to learn, and complex game system can be easy to learn. So while affected by the complexity of the rules, other factors come into play when understanding this aspect of any set of rules. Final factor to consider is supporting material, which is required for players to create force mixes, set up a game, and play the game. Many free rules may be good, but they lack cheat sheets, equipment lists, army lists, and scenarios. This requires players to make an enormous amount of effort to simply get a game off the ground. These rules, that is a DBN version 2.1, are based on DBA, which is an ancient set of rules, and clearly went through a number of changes. In summary, they are designed for 15mm players to have a game on a playing area which is a 2-foot square with what's called 12 points per side, or basically 12 elements per side. While the number of elements in DBN do vary a bit, we can assume this does average out to 12 elements. While there is a version which uses a 3 feet wide by 2 foot deep playing area and with 24 points per side, the rules were specifically designed for a 2-foot square playing area, and that's where they shine. As with DBA, this is very much an element maneuver game, where the way you maneuver elements gives you victory or causes you to lose. There is nothing wrong with this, and it gives you a very interesting game, but this may not be what some players were looking for in a set of rules. First, looking at basing, the basing is reasonably standard, with elements being 4 cm wide and either 2 cm, 3 cm, or 4 cm deep, depending on the type of element. However, an optional basing system is suggested where infantry are placed on a 3 cm deep base in 2 ranks. This is the way I've based my DBN force mix, as you can see in the images in this video. While for DBN I like it because you rarely have elements behind each other, for other rules I never base my infantry 2 ranks deep. It's a lot of figures for little benefit and does not allow for much diorama on the base. Saying that, I like the idea of standardizing all infantry and cavalry bases at 3 cm deep. I must admit DBN suggests 2.5 cm deep, but I don't know anyone who does not use 3 cm deep bases with these rules. I'm planning on basing my new infantry figures on 3 cm deep bases, but with only 1 rank of figures, so I can put more bling on the base. It also allows me to use movement trays, which use standard 4x3 cm slots, which can be used for both infantry and cavalry. Sure, artillery does not get included, but I'm even considering putting small artillery, such as 4 and 3 pounders, on 3 cm deep bases as well. And the larger artillery probably would not be actually merged in with the units anyway. Let's first start with game scale. If we look at a 12-point battle, the forces which each player would expect to command is about 20,000 to 30,000 men each, which represents 12 to 18 elements, with 18 elements being rather rare. So a Prussian 1815 army would consist of 4 musketeers and 8 militia musketeers, and 2 light cavalry, and 2 militia light cavalry, and 1 Napoleonic artillery element, which gives me a force mix of 17 elements at a cost of 12 points. This gives me an army of 24,000 to 30,000 infantry, 4,800 to 6,000 cavalry, and 18 cannons, that is, cannons not part of the infantry formations. This represents a force as large as the First Corps in 1815, although the troop composition isn't the same as that corps. This force mix would allow you to refight Marengo with ease, but with a larger conflict such as Ligny, this would require more points, perhaps even as much as 36 points, if not more. This can be done with more than one player commanding a single Prussian corps each. Of course, a Prussian corps in 1815 was rather large, and this would probably represent about 4 French corps on the other side. But basically, you could probably do Ligny with teams of players on each side with comparative ease. The other factor to consider is element width. The Prussian force of 17 elements would cover a front line of 68 centimetres, which is wider than your or our preferred 2 foot or 60 centimetre wide playing area. A more reasonable force would be 12 elements, which would span a maximum of 48 centimetres, allowing for the flanks to remain empty. I must admit, with this kind of force mix with so much militia, I would actually probably have quite a few of the infantry musketeers too deep, so I could actually field 17 elements on a 60 centimetre wide playing area and still have some gaps on either end, but probably not much of a gap. In terms of ground scale, I could not find any specific ground scale apart from the comment that 100 paces equals 2.5 centimetres. If a pace is 60 centimetres, and yes, I know different nationalities use different measurements for their paces, with the Prussians, I think from memory, using 66, let's just assume it's 60 centimetres because it makes the math easy. Then the ground scale is 1 in 2400, or 60 metres equals 2.5 centimetres for 15 mil figures. This means our 2,000 to 2,400 infantry element would have a frontage of about 100 metres, rounding up. In paces, it would be 160 paces. This is a density of 15 men per pace, which is rather high, but not unreasonable for the latter period of the war. These troops never really adopt a line formation in any real manner, which at a size of 2,400 infantry is basically a large regiment or brigade, is much greater than 160 paces. Still, the density is high, very high, when compared with overall real battles such as Marengo, where the Austrians achieved a density of 10 men per metre, which means that we're talking about about half the density that these elements would provide. I could be wrong, but I suspect a bit of scale stretching is occurring here, and the actual ground scale is closer to 1 in 5,000, or 1 centimetre equals 50 metres, if not more. I must point out that troop density did alter during the Napoleonic War, starting off at around about 10 men or 8 men per pace at the beginning, and ending up with maybe 16 at the end, but the end is really only the largest battles. If 1 in 5,000 scale is used, our playing area would span 3,000 metres, which is still reasonably small considering the number of men we have in that spot. This is totally understandable. Once you get to scales greater than 1 in 5,000 or even 1 in 5,000, musket fire ranges becomes ridiculously small, possibly 2 centimetres. So in order to avoid these ludicrously small musket ranges, I think the designers decided to do a bit of scale mixing and basically said that everything was 1 in 2400, but the element scale was actually 1 in 5000, and let's just not worry about the details too much. Let's look at playing area scale. That's fairly easy. The standard playing area is a 2 foot square area or playing area, which represents either 1.5 kilometre square or 3 kilometres square, depending on what ground scale we want to assume the game uses. You can actually increase the number of points to 24 and increase the width of the playing area to 3 feet, if you so desire. Each game turn represents about 15 minutes of play, which I think at this scale seems rather low. The first part of Marengo spanned from 1000 hours to 1400 hours, which would take 12 game turns to play. Thus, you could probably do that in a day, but you could never probably get to the end of Marengo, and Marengo was not a particularly large battle. I must admit I would have probably expected a timescale of closer to 30 minutes per game turn, considering the element and maybe the ground scale of 1 in 5,000. But with a low number of elements and a rapid game system, I expect it's possible to get through a significant number of game turns very quickly, so possibly you can actually game 36 game turns and refight Marengo from beginning to end, although the playing area is probably a lot bigger than our 2-foot square in that case. In the terrain setup, unlike DBA, we don't have such a restrictive terrain setup system, but instead something more generic. There is a lot of terrain setup rules, and this is covered very well indeed, as it is actually in DBA and pretty much all of the old WRG sets of rules. The sequence of play is classically simple. Each player conducts movement and combat before the opponent does, a classic I go, you go sequence of play. This is very similar to a standard board gaming sequence of play, and while I feel it has issues in terms of play simplicity, it cannot be bettered. If playing the standard 12-point army, each player gets one commander, which is called a CNC. If you're going to a 24 or 36-point game, you can increase the number of commanders as you increase the number of players. Basically, you're doing a team game. One player is the CNC, the others being sub-commanders, but basically you're really playing very separate games. If playing the optional rules for larger games, you get a single CNC and a number of subordinate sub-commanders. However, the game is very much designed for 12-point armies, of which there is only one commander. But, as you've probably guessed from the sequence of play, it is actually optimised for team play, and that's, I think, possibly its second sweet spot. The command system is based on command points or command action points, which has each commander spinning a d6 each game turn to determine how many caps it has to spend. There are some modifiers, such as the attacker getting an extra 2 caps on game turn 1 and some historical leader modifications, but for the most part, each player spins a d6, the result is the number of caps that commander gets, and that tells that commander how much it can do during that game turn. Nice and simple. The rules achieve a kind of historical command control limitation by giving commanders a command radius of 30 centimetres, beyond which it costs an extra cap to do anything. As you can see, with an average of 3 caps per game turn, spending 2 on something because those forces are very far away nicely limits the abilities of forces to spread out in an unhistorical manner. Thus, at 30 centimetres, the CNC sits in the centre of the playing area and should not wander from this location if at all possible. There are lines LOS restrictions as well, so terrain may reduce this range. Once again, a nice and simple manner of reflecting command control ranges. So what can you do with these caps? Without going into too much complexity, it costs 1 cap to move a single element or any group of elements in base-to-base contact with each other. For those familiar with DBN, DBMM and of course DBA, this is no surprise. It's a nice and simple way of reflecting the difficulties of getting your army to do what it needs to without implementing ungainly rules around orders, reaction tests or other methods to restrict what a commander can get his forces to do in a single game turn. The rules do allow for 4 morale or quality classes which provide advantage or disadvantage in direct fire or close combat. Basically, Old Guard gets a +2 in close combat, Elite gets a +1 for direct fire or close combat, Militia Levy get a -1 in close combat. Elite get an advantage in morale tests as well, and Militia get a disadvantage when using the alternate rules. While optional rules, there are some general modifiers around the amount of cap that generals have, as you can see here. In addition, some commanders can also give troops in close combat an advantage, but those commanders risk death. These are all optional and would generally not be used in a normal 12-point game, but they're available if you so desire. The movement system is nice and simple with only 3 movement allowances: good going, bad going and roads. The rules also support a form of strategic movement as well, allowing for double moves. There are a lot of rules associated with elements in base-to-base contact moving together, because obviously in order to avoid spending lots of cap, you're going to try and keep all your stuff together, and it tries to limit what you can do when you do so. And I actually consider that as A, quite historically accurate, and B, a very good game system implementation. Nice and simple and achieves very good objectives. Surprisingly, the rules do actually contain the concept of line or column. Attack column really being the most significant formation. This basically consists of two musket elements, one behind the other, which gives you a close combat advantage. This image shows an example with the element with the flag in it having an element directly behind it to form an attack column. The other elements are all single. You'll notice these are all the 3 centimetre deep bases. Simple and elegant rule. I particularly like this. There are two types of combat, fire combat and close combat. Each occurs within its own phase. As can be seen here, the standard musket range is 5 centimetres, which aligns with a scale of 1 in 2400, and certainly not a scale of 1 in 500. This is the reason why I think the designers played around with the scales a bit. The combat system adds a D6 with the unit's tactical factors, and then combat factors. Combat factors could be 0. One point, if you are familiar with DBA, then you will know that a target of fire combat or missile combat also spins, even though they cannot affect the enemy. This is done so the two scores can be compared to determine a result. Because the combat results table is in the sheet section or the appendix section, it does not contain the all-important clue that says elements not being fired upon may ignore any result, which, while still vague, gives you the clue the target element has to spin as well. This seems to be missing here. So if we look at an example, a musket element firing another musket element spins a d6, let's say getting a 4. Then it adds its tactical factors, which includes its morale and any special situations. In most cases there may be fire support, but let's assume there is none, so we move to the combat factors, which is a +4. Thus the result is 8. That's the attacker. The enemy does the same and achieves a value of 7. The difference is not sufficient for any result. If the attacker spun a 6 and the enemy a 1, the result would be 11 versus 5, which is more than 2 to 1 difference. This means the enemy is destroyed. If the attacker achieved a 6 and the enemy a 4, then the enemy would recoil. Just to reiterate, if you're firing against cavalry which does not contain any musket, the cavalry still spins, even though it can never affect the firers. The close combat uses the same basic system, but the elements need to be in base-to-base contact with each other. A number of modifiers are specific to close combat only, with morale being a lot more important in this kind of combat. If you have militia, it's best to avoid close combat and keep on firing with muskets instead. The combat results do vary by troop type, especially when in close combat, as can be seen here. I find the descriptions rather confusing, but once you understand what it means, it's easy to remember. The rules do offer an alternate combat system which requires tracking of hits. While this does improve the combat system on many levels, the issue is the game system's main focus is playability, and adding additional complexity, even if it's historical, goes against the basic design philosophy of the rules. If you want something more accurate or historical, you would probably adopt a very different game system. I personally use the original system with all its flaws because it's easier and makes the gameplay quicker. But at 15-minute game turns, the alternate combat system is probably more historically accurate if the scale is 1 in 2400. On the other hand, I think the game turn length is a fudge, with infantry being able to travel 7.5 centimetres or 375 metres in 15 minutes at 1 in 5,000 scale rather ambitious if the ground scale truly is 1 in 5,000. At 1 in 2400 scale, then the infantry are travelling 180 metres, which of course is quite reasonable. Thus the argument is, what is the real ground scale? It seems to be a mix. If the ground scale is 1 in 5,000, then a game turn scale of 30 minutes is probably more reasonable. But anyway, and if that's the case, then the original combat system is probably optimum rather than the optional one. The issues with trying to fudge scales in order to make the game play better. And I must admit, the fudging of scales is actually required in these rules, so I'm not being critical of it. Well, let's look at morale and reaction tests. Well, what can I say? There are no quality, morale or reaction tests. The game is so simple, there's no need. Any morale is factored into the combat system. This is a major plus for gameplay. The alternate combat system does have a morale-like system, but it is nonetheless still fairly simple. Well, how do we win? Once a player has lost 1/3 of its elements, they have lost. There is some additional special rules, but victory is firmly based on killing enemy elements. In most rules, this results in rather boring games as players try and avoid risk. But due to the dynamic nature of this game system, this is generally not an issue here. I suppose based on terrain placement, you could end up with a stalemate. This is why you need to be very careful about terrain deployment. Now we come to the rules layout. Personally, it's adequate and certainly not as bad as many other set of rules that I'm aware of, but it's certainly not optimal. There are a lot of unnecessary words as well as alternate game systems mixed in with the standard game system. It makes it hard to find rules in the heat of battle. In defense of the rules, the game system is so simple that once you have mastered it, there is very little need to refer to the rules. But a learning document is certainly a good thing, and as a learning document, the rules are certainly below average. The videos help a great deal, but what may be required is a training guide and a reference version of the rules with all the non-rules words removed. I may do this myself and format into a 3-column format with 8-point font, which keeps the length of the rules down to about a dozen pages, if not less. But it would be nice if the designers considered reformatting the rules. Place as much bling at the start and at the end of the rules, but the actual rules should be short, concise and referenceable. But it's certainly not the worst set of rules I've ever seen, far from it, but it's certainly in the needs improving group. Let's look at special rules, which can sometimes cause a major issue with many sets of rules. Now, this is a fairly difficult question to answer here, as the nature of the rules encourage a host of special rules. However, most are contained in the charts and tables, so they are actually not a significant issue. I generally find the special rules, where they exist, to provide a lot of bang for the effort in remembering them, and as they are mainly in the charts and tables, there's not really much downside in having them. There are a lot of optional rules in the appendix, but these are optional and certainly not something which I consider as negative in any way, shape or form. I consider that the way the special rules are structured, the number and the way they're embedded in the charts, one of the real strengths of these rules, which I would hope is the case considering the design objective of simplicity. There's nothing worse than finding a set of rules with a list of special conditions buried in the body which you've got to desperately try and remember. And this can be a bane even for simple game systems. That's not the case here. Record keeping. The amount of record keeping on the playing area is minimal, which I can tell you now is a major plus. The optional combat system would require some record keeping, which I have to admit, considering each side will only probably have 12 elements each, is not a burden, but nonetheless it is a potential downside. Playing this set of rules will not cause your head to hurt. Apart from some minor calculating when you need to add up 3 numbers together, which I would hope everyone would be able to do fairly easily, there is no need to be able to do long division in your head. This is a major plus. Now we come to scenarios, supporting material and things that you need in order to start and have a game very quickly. Now there are very few, if any, scenarios, but these rules don't require scenarios. The rules contain a very detailed and extensive army list, with the method of calculating force mixes being very simple and easy, and thus play can begin very quickly. This is a points style game. It's not really optimized for the recreation of historical games. Thus I consider this another major strength of the rules. You can pick an army and start playing with minimal effort, ideal for club play. Drilling down into the army list in more detail, this shows an example of 3 Austrian army lists, each for a specific period. The point system is very simple. Any element is 1 point, with militia being half a point and elite being 1.5 points and guard 2 points. If there was a supreme strength to this game system, it's how easy and quick it is to set up a game on an ad hoc basis. Great for club games or for competition games. What are my conclusions? Well, look, in conclusion, these rules are surprisingly good. They are simple and reasonably easy to learn if someone is instructing you. I will almost certainly create an examples document to assist players in learning the rules, which makes the job even easier. I should note, even experienced players may forget details if the gaps between games are great enough, so such a document is always useful to all players. Play is a pleasure, but it needs to be noted these are element maneuver rules, almost like chess. This gives you a great game, quick, simple, and you get a result, but there is little thought of operational strategy. As with 12 to 17 elements, there is little opportunity to pin an enemy, exhaust them, and send your reserves in at the right moment. I expect this is one reason for the optional combat system. So if a player wishes this type of game, that may provide part of what you need to achieve that kind of game, particularly if you have a larger game. Now look, I must admit, players who like to form line, square and column may not be really that happy with the rules. While the designers have done a great job adding as much historical flavour as possible to the basic system without impacting its simplicity, this is not a game system focused on duplicating history. However, this is a real sweet spot in the market these days. There has been a boom of what I call big base rules, where each player gets 6 to 18 big bases consisting of strength points or traditional elements. Examples are Blucher. These really move the bar into board game territory, but give you a quick, simple, and in some case historically accurate game. DBN achieves the same thing without moving so far into board game territory and still retaining the flavour of actually figures on an element. Basically, it's an element-based game which achieves all the benefits of these big base games. Now, I have to admit, I've never tried games which involved multiple commanders. It goes without question, if you're having team games, this game system will work very well indeed. Thus, 2 players a side will require a playing area 4 feet wide, 3 players 6 feet, and so on. Each player gets 12 points, and once one is the CNC. This would work very well. However, what we are seeing is separate games with minimal interaction between each game. However, saying that, the designers do actually make a very good attempt to make this game system work with larger battles, with 1 player a side. Each army consists of corps with a sub-commander each, which cannot exchange caps, but there is a CNC which can use its caps to command any troops under direct control, or it may transfer these to sub-commanders. Instead of dicing, each sub-commander has a fixed number of cap. This is a very nice system and works very well. The only issue is player overload. DBN is a chess-like game system where a player really has to focus on how and when he moves his elements carefully. 24 elements may be reasonable, but once we get to 48 elements, we may end up with a game which is simply too large and takes too long to play. The other major issue is the number of game turns required. Using the traditional combat system, this could be manageable, but the optional combat system adds significantly greater load, and clearly the optional combat system is designed to try and reproduce larger historical battles. However, there are lots of rules out there which result in games which can never be expected to complete in a reasonable time frame. So this is not really a major criticism, but Jesus, I wish those other rules didn't have that problem, and I certainly wish this set of rules wouldn't have the problem if you're playing a large game. I only bring this up because the original design philosophy was revolutionary and brilliant, and expanding the size of the game defeats its basic value add. In terms of comparisons, I find this rather startling, but I can't help but compare this game system to Philip Saban's Lost Battle, which is an area movement ancient set of rules. Both strip away as much bling as possible to result in a set of rules which allow you to have a good game. DBN is quicker, simpler, but possibly less historical. Apart from this comparison, I can't think of many rules like these rules. I played a club set of rules called Tiel back in the 1990s, which was also based on DBA, but it was always designed to be a set of rules which required 50 elements aside on a larger table. There was no provision for a 2-foot square game. It simply borrowed a number of DBA game system elements rather than being DBA for Napoleonics. I converted a game system into Napoleonics which has some elements to this rule, but the main influence was DBM or DBMM, although the core game system was based on Bruce Reed Taylor's Core Commander, or a quick play version of it. But all these rules are club rules or free rules, so in the area of commercial rules, these stand out. This is a good thing because it fills a gap in the market, which is what new rules should always aim for. Just a quick comments about scale. I previously raised this, and I can't help but think the game designers had to make some compromises to achieve their objectives. The ground scale for movement in fire combat is clearly 1 in 2400, which matches the game turn length of 15 minutes. But the element scale really does look like it's closer to 1 in 5000. If I'm correct, the simple solution is simply state the element's scale is hard. Thus, an infantry element represents 1000 to 1200 men, and we solve the problem with no other changes, assuming there was even a problem to start off with. This also reduces the size of a 12-point force mix to 10,000 to 12,000 men each, closer to a French corps in size, although not a Prussian corps. But this has no impact on game system, so it's more a personal comment or observation that I made looking at these rules and playing them. What about suggestion? The game system is very good, gameplay excellent, detail and historical accuracy suffers as a result, but this was never the primary objective, so I can't see any suggestions in that particular area. The designers have done a brilliant job converting DBA into a Napoleonic system, and I think they've done a reasonable job in allowing for larger games. I personally feel larger games should use a DBMM or DBM game system, but using a DBA system, but using that system, this is about as good as you can expect. The rules layout is kind of acceptable, but certainly not great. The best way to learn the rules is have someone show you how to play it. The videos help, but a lot of the detail is glossed over. The videos are more of a video of a game rather than training material, but they do kind of help. I think this is probably the only main suggestion I would make, and that's around the rules. My only real suggestion is I would personally consider reformatting the rules, adding more cross-referencing and creating a separate examples document to help new players learn the game system. But I have to admit I could say the same thing about almost every other set of Napoleonic rules I possess, so this is no real failure on the designer. I would strongly recommend these rules to anyone. And so we come to the end of this video. This concludes part 30 of my video series on game system design, in this case a specific analysis of the DBN rules. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hill, Heimatland zu kämpfen.